20th century was a time of incredible change, unspeakable horrors, and amazing leaps of scientific discovery. It was a century marked by events that united and divided us, from great feats to great wars, with advancements and setbacks that showed us the power of many, the power of one.
I have a dream.
A century of revolutions, evolutions, and retributions. A century made by conflicts and crimes, inventions and entertainment, politics, protests, discoveries, and disasters.
Oh, humanity.
We will count down the 101 events of the 20th century. Their stories form the tapestry of our history and shape the world in which we live.
The question naturally arose of what would happen to any Nazi leaders who were captured.
Well, this was one of the darkest chapters in the UN's history.
Someone had to take that brave step.
"16 minutes, 2 teenage boys, a massacre that would rock America, fueling pleas for gun control that would rage for years to come." On the 20th of April 1999, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, two students of Columbine High School, Littleton, Colorado, set off firebombs to distract attention while they stormed the school with assault weapons. 12 students and teacher William David Sanders were killed in the attack, most in the school library to which they had fled for safety.
Jefferson County 911. Yes, I'm a teacher at Columbine High School. There is a student here with a gun.
Over 20 more students were injured.
Everybody knows about them walking in with the guns and shooting lots of their classmates. They also had a series of bombs planted around the school. Had they gone off, they would have killed hundreds of people. So their main motivation was mayhem and terror.
And then he came in, they started blowing up and shooting everyone in the cafeteria.
At the end of their rampage, Harris and Klebold turned the guns on themselves, committing suicide in a school hallway. In the full glare of the world's press, the town faced its loss and horror. And around the world, people asked the question, why? Initially described as loners and misfits, some of the answers seem to lie in the boys' social status at the school as outsiders. Through journals left behind by Harris and Klebold, investigators discovered they had been planning for more than a year to bomb the school in an attack similar to the 1995 Oklahoma City bombings. The police investigation also looked at how they had come into possession of the firearms. Within weeks, Mark Maines and Philip Duran were found guilty of selling firearms to minors and sentenced to 5 years in prison. Although not the first mass shooting in the US that decade or even that year, the Columbine tragedy reopened the debate on US gun control. The Million Mum March, held in Washington, D.C. and 60 other US cities, urged American Congress to act on the issue.
The mothers who are marching and countless millions of mothers like us around our country have a very simple Mother's Day message. We don't want flowers or jewelry. We don't want a nice card or a fancy meal as much as we want our Congress to do the right thing to protect our children.
The connection of the Columbine school massacre to broader gun culture in the US is one of access. There are more guns than people in the United States. There are over 70 million semi-automatic weapons. Then there is language in the Constitution that makes reference, in whatever way you want to interpret it, to the citizens being armed.
From my cold, dead hands.
The massacre was the worst school shooting in US history to that time, a record that will be overtaken in the coming decade.
The overall impact of Columbine is a very sad one in the sense that this is now something that happens. So now when shootings in schools occur, there is outrage, but it dies down very quickly. It has become an almost kind of normal part of American society that children will die in schools because of guns.
An item of clothing praised as liberator and condemned as oppressor. It has been an icon of the fashion world and a symbol for protesters, but through it all, an invention used by millions of women around the world. Many women started the 20th century laced in tight corsets that restricted their bodies and movements.
Poor great-grandmama, how she suffered to please great-grandpapa.
In 1910, Mary Phelps Jacob, a 19-year-old Manhattan socialite, was unhappy with how a cumbersome corset poked out of the gown in which she intended to wow society. Desperation inspired ingenuity.
One of the stories, the origins of the bra, is one young debutante had a beautiful dress, but she had all this corset underneath, hated it. So what she did was use 2 hankies, cover her breasts, tie it round with a ribbon, and voila, there's the bra.
Jacobs patented her backless brassiere on the 3rd of November 1914. But the bra owed its big boost to an international conflict.
It is really World War I, where women have to give up using metal stays, metal things that support their undergarments. That is given to the war effort, and the undergarments become simpler.
Each change of fashion through the decades brought new improvements to the bra.
Then in the 1930s, where you have not only uplift but outlift, because they're able to have conical bras, then fashion can accentuate that. Like the sweater girl, sweaters were seen as something just, utilitarian. But once this bra comes along that points the breasts out and she's photographed in such a sexual way, then the fashion for that type of clothing takes off.
However, in the 1960s, what had once given women freedom to move was now seen as a sign of oppression.
The feminists talk about bras as being a construction. We're going to burn them, or metaphorically, they'll burn them, get rid of them. We don't need these bras. That constructs women as they were.
Although mass bra burnings were a myth, the idea of bra-burning feminists remained an iconic but imagined image in the public mind, morphing into a criticism and stereotype that dogged the feminist movement.
It was a cold day for a demonstration, but the women stuck it out, while presumably their husbands stayed at home cooking for the kids.
Rarely has an item of clothing been so linked to women's role in society. And by the end of the 20th century, an estimated 95% of Western women were fastening themselves into bras each morning.
The bra over the 20th century gives women far more independence. So we're moving from a restrictive set of undergarments through to still quite highly constructed in the mid-century to the end of the century, again comes back to that strong construction, but the way it's marketed, the way it's perceived, it's helped women give themselves a lot more confidence.
A coup that overturned the democratically elected government, made possible by interference from the United States. An act that would lead to one of Latin America's darkest chapters. At the start of the 1970s, fear of a Red Scare spreading through Central and South America gripped Washington. Fidel Castro's victory in Cuba had put the United States on high alert. In 1970, presidential elections in Chile swept the left-wing candidate to power.
In September, Dr. Salvador Allende was elected president of Chile, the first Marxist head of state on the continent to achieve power by democratic means. A portent, perhaps, of things to come.
Salvador Allende was, if nothing else, an absolute committed Democrat. In many ways, a lot of people would argue that this was his undoing. The Americans basically decided they would not allow him his full term because they were afraid of a second Castro in Chile.
Allende's social reforms included nationalizing natural resources, building homes for the poor, and improving access to health and education. But due to US interference, which affected the price of Chile's most valuable export, copper, by 1973, the Chilean economy was in disarray. And violence between the right and left had become a daily occurrence. Allende had the support of workers, but opposition to him was growing. On September the 11th, 1973, the Chilean armed forces launched an attack against Allende's government. The coup was led by the army chief Augusto Pinochet. Tanks and troops surrounded La Moneda, the presidential palace, and Allende and his supporters were ordered to surrender or face attack by the Chilean Air Force. Allende refused.
He died because of his idealism. The Mexican government basically offered him a safe conduit out of the bombarded National Palace. He could have got out and he said, no, I am going nowhere, I'm staying here.
Jet fighter attacks set the palace alight.
There were 2 bomber pilots, and they'd fly around the building. They flew around our apartment building, and then they'd bomb the Moneda, and then they'd go around. They went around about 10 times.
Soon after, there are shots, and Salvador Allende is found dead in his sofa. Close to him is a rifle that Fidel Castro had given him. There develops this cloud over what happened to Salvador Allende. Did he kill himself? Was he killed by some of the stray bullets that were flying around the palace?
In the aftermath of the coup, Pinochet became dictator of Chile. Over the next 17 years, more than 3,000 of Pinochet's political opponents, critics, and dissidents were assassinated or disappeared.
Tens of thousands of Chileans now live in exile rather than under Pinochet.
In 1988, Pinochet's opponents took their chance to oust him when a referendum was held, removing him from power.
And Salvador Allende was posing the absolute civilized concept of what a true revolution of the people could look like, not through bloodshed, but through the ballot box. And I think that's remained. We no longer have military coups. We have people who are trying to make a difference, radical difference, through the ballot box.
In the wake of the Second World War, the Allies would take an unprecedented approach to holding their enemies' actions to account. An international tribunal and a new legal concept, war crimes.
As the Second World War came to its horribly violent conclusion in Europe in the spring of 1945, the question naturally arose of what would happen to any Nazi leaders who were captured.
The sure, swift course of retribution faces them all.
There was an enormous sense among all of the Allies that some form of punishment, of retribution would have to be undertaken. It was the Americans, very largely, who said, no, we have a larger historic mission here, which is these terrible, terrible crimes will not go unpunished, but that punishment will be reached after a fair and proper legal process.
The trials of the leading Nazis were held at Nuremberg from November 1945. The location was a symbolic choice, as it evoked memories of past Nazi rallies. It was also big enough for the purpose and largely undamaged after the war.
A special enclosed passage has been built between the jail and the courtroom. Pretty well all the big noises of Hitler's Reich, except Hitler himself, of course, and Bormann, are to be tried.
2 judges, each from England, France, America, and the Soviet Union, presided.
It was decided that the tribunal should be made up of representatives of the 4 major Allied powers, and this inevitably meant that, in the eyes of critics, this appeared as victors' justice.
Over 4 years, 13 separate trials were held, organised according to the type of offence of which those on trial stood accused.
When the chart of the Nazi organisation was displayed in court, for example, it evoked great interest from everybody present.
It was decided to establish new legal charges against the defendants. These are the charges with which we're now very familiar, terms like crimes against peace, crimes against humanity.
The proceedings led to the United Nations Genocide Convention and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which both occurred in 1948. 24 men were accused in the first trial. Each of them pleaded not guilty.
Bekenne mich im Sinne der Anklage nicht schuldig. Nicht schuldig. Nein.
That will be entered as a plea of not guilty.
But only 3 escaped conviction. 12 were sentenced to death. Perhaps the most significant effect of Nuremberg and of the equivalent trials in Japan is that they made clear and public and established the criminality of the unprecedented events of the Second World War.
The other lasting legacy of Nuremberg in setting a template for that machinery of international justice to prosecute war criminals. That machinery may still be flawed. We know there are significant countries around the world which will not take part in it, but it's all we've got at the moment.
The modern Olympic movement was built on the notion of athletes from around the world competing together in a spirit of friendship and fair play, an ideal that would be shattered one day in 1972. In the lead up to the 1972 Games in Munich, the German organisers have been determined to counter the image that clung to Germany post-war.
After 36 years, the Olympic Games will take place again in Germany, in the Federal Republic.
Well, for West Germany, these games were a really important way to erase the horrible images of the Nazi Olympic Games. What the West Germans wanted to do was to present a new Germany, to present a new image of Germany in the minds of the world through this very popular spectacle as being a modern, progressive, democratic, culturally and economically dynamic nation.
Guards were to be unarmed and approachable. The Olympic Village was not protected. Its fences were low and its security limited, although the global political climate was very different.
There was plenty of evidence that terrorism was on the rise. Hijackings and other terrorist incidents were occurring around the world. On the other hand, there wasn't anything specific targeting the Olympic Games. That is probably because the Palestinian Black September group that was doing it was very good at keeping information very limited within its specific terrorist cells.
The Games opened on August 26 and continued without mishap until the early morning of September 5. At 4:30 a.m., members of the Palestinian Black September group had no trouble gaining access to the Olympic Village apartments. They took 2 members of the Israeli team hostage and killed another 2.
He gave an ultimatum that until 12 o'clock today, some of the Arabic terrorists who are held in prison in Israel must be released, otherwise are going to kill some of the sportsmen who are staying there in their hands.
Israel refused the demand.
The Germans responded ineptly, with total incompetence. This is pretty much the universal assessment. They didn't know what to do, they dithered. There was a point where they tried a rescue mission, not quite realizing that there were television crews all around the building where the hostages were at that time. And the terrorists in this building were watching what was happening to the building on television.
The stalemate continued until the group demanded to be taken with the hostages to the airport. When the terrorists reached the airport, German snipers shot at the group, starting a gunfight. The hostages were killed, along with 5 of the terrorists and a German policeman.
Inside the airfield, the scene was described by one eyewitness as the most horrible thing I've ever seen.
The surviving 3 members of the group were arrested, but they were released within weeks when Black September hijacked a plane and demanded their freedom.
Now, it's true that we haven't seen a major terrorist attack at the Olympics since then. It does seem that terrorists are deterred by the increased security at the Olympics now.
The events of September 1972 were a tragic failure, which encouraged countries to learn from the mistakes and train specialist anti-terror units. It started as a shipping accident and became an environmental disaster. 1,000 miles of coastland contaminated by an oil spill that left enduring devastation in its wake. On the 24th of March 1989, the oil tanker Exxon Valdez hit the Bligh Reef in Alaska's Prince William Sound.
This was a ship that was carrying nearly 53 million US gallons of oil, and when it struck the reef, it released almost 10.8 to 11 million US gallons of oil over a few days.
The oil washed up on the beach and spread during the storm, defying the containment effort. This was a man-made disaster in which nature came in to finish the job. Oil spread to several islands off the Alaskan coast and affected the wildlife there.
Here we are looking at crude oil, which is made up of many different hydrocarbon organic compounds. And some of these organic compounds could be extremely toxic. So in the short term, when you look at the impact, it was massive.
But virtually every American is familiar with the tragic environmental disaster in Alaskan waters. We all share the sorrow and concern of Alaskans and the determination to mount a sustained cleanup effort.
It was not the first oil spill, and it would not be the last. Yet the effects were devastating. Thousands of sea animals died. The defining image of the disaster was birds covered so thickly in oil they could no longer breathe. Other images showed holes dug into the ground barely a meter before they met oil.
Our ultimate goal must be the complete restoration of the ecology and the economy of Prince William Sound, including all of its fish, marine mammals, birds, and other wildlife.
The cleanup was massive and immediate, but despite the collaborative effort, the oil was not completely cleaned away. Animals contaminated with oil were sent to a rehabilitation centre. The heron-based fishing industry in the area collapsed. Seals and whale pack numbers dwindled. Scientists have learned a lot about the effects left from the spill, including the environment's limited ability to recover. Years on, the damage is still extensive, and bird populations have not come back to pre-spill levels. This was a man-made disaster in the relatively pristine Alaskan Sound, and its proximity to an untouched wilderness caught a strong negative media reaction. Exxon, as the company operating the tanker, was tied up in court cases related to the event beyond the end of the 20th century, finally succeeding in having the original punitive damages awarded at $5 billion, reduced to $500 million.
I think on a positive front, not many people would look at it that way. There are so many controls that have been put in place now. For instance, whenever they have ships, you have tugboats, they guide them as to how they can come out of that place, for instance. There are new techniques of monitoring, there are new techniques of remediation, which basically means that on the one hand, you prevent this from happening, and if it does happen, there are processes that are put in place where people can immediately respond to these incidences.
Escalating conflict in Afghanistan became the catalyst for the rise of new non-state groups. they will be the country's only hope for opposing one of the world's great superpowers. At the end of the 1970s, the Communist People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan took control of the country, ousting the secular government of Daoud Khan.
When the PDPA came into power, they started implementing reform programs that reflected a communist agenda. And these were highly unpopular programs, not so much in terms of the substance, but the way in which the communist PDPA was going about implementing them.
A rebel movement, the Mujahideen, formed from local militias, began to strike against the central government. On the 24th of December 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, fearing its communist ally would be defeated by the Mujahideen.
It was important for the Soviet Union to see that the experiment of social and political engineering that was happening in Afghanistan would be a success. And as Afghanistan itself started to destabilize following the PDPA coup, it became a threat to the Soviet Union's southern borders. That impelled the Soviet Union to invade Afghanistan.
Over the next decade, the Soviet Union was to pour billions of dollars into the war, a burden that Mikhail Gorbachev considered when he came to power in 1985.
And Afghan rebels have proved themselves as much trouble to the Russians as they were to the British 100 years ago.
But the question is, why didn't the Soviets withdraw in 1986 and waited until 1989? For two reasons. One was to provide a safe-facing exit for the Soviet withdrawal, and secondly, not to show that they're weak. Based on these reasons, the Soviet Union waited until 1989 to withdraw.
Soviet troops began to withdraw on the 15th of May 1988, with the last pulling out on the 15th of February 1989. The toll of the war had been high. In over a decade, more than 15,000 Soviet troops had been killed, and more than 1 million Afghans had died, with millions more made refugees.
600,000 Afghan refugees who have poured across the Khyber Mountains now form the largest concentration of refugees in the world.
Without Russian backing, Kabul fell to the rebels in 1992. Those who now took power, since they opposed the Soviet proxy, had American backing.
We support the Afghan efforts to fashion a stable, broadly based government responsive to the needs of the Afghan people.
The collapse of the Afghan government in 1992 created a security and political vacuum which allowed fundamentalist groups such as the Afghan Taliban, Al-Qaeda, ETIM, amongst others, to establish themselves within Afghanistan and then to export their radicalist agenda overseas.
The fight for traditional values became a fight against communism. Now, after 10 bloody years, the Soviets are gone. The question is, what comes next?
People often forget that from 1929 until 1978, Afghanistan was one of the most peaceful countries in the world. So the legacy of the Soviet intervention in 1979 is very much responsible for the disruption that Afghanistan faced, from which Afghanistan has not been able to recover.
At the close of the 19th century, a cycling craze was peddling across the world, a fascination that would spawn one of the 20th century's greatest sporting events. Cycling enthusiasts were buying sporting magazines to experience more about techniques and tactics. In France, L'Auto magazine first went to print in 1900, but circulation was sluggish. An editorial meeting was convened to find answers to the circulation crisis. And Gilles Lefebvre, the magazine's 26-year-old cycling and rugby correspondent, suggested a race around France. And so the world's greatest endurance race, over mountain terrain and through medieval towns, began as a promotion to sell magazines. On the 1st of July 1903, 60 cyclists set off from Paris to cover the 2,428-kilometre track, reaching an average speed of 25.7 kilometres per hour. The cyclists returned to Paris nearly 3 weeks later on July 19th. The first winner was a 32-year-old Frenchman, Maurice Garin. The race grew in popularity each year with competitors and spectators as routes over the Pyrenees were added.
They're high in the Pyrenees now. The air is rare and every breath is torture. And tragedy strikes with chilling swiftness. Somebody went over the edge.
Apart from the two world wars, no races were run between 1915 and 1918, or 1940 and 1946. The Tour de France grew in popularity around the world. By the 1960s, some stages were being held in neighbouring countries.
The Tour de France is held in different locations. It hasn't got a fixed route. It's changed over time to accommodate different cities. And when it changes to places it hasn't been before, it's a fantastic celebration of cycling and what that can bring people together.
At Plymouth, the famous Tour de France comes to Britain for the first time in all 71 years of its existence.
The enduring symbol of the race, the yellow jersey, was first introduced in 1919 to make the race leader stand out. The effort to be a Tour cyclist was immense, right from the start.
They've got to have a very good power-to-weight ratio in order to get up the mountain stages. They would be used to riding long-duration events over time, so they've done other tours. And that ability to be able to sustain a tour is what makes it.
The race had changed dramatically by the mid-90s. Cyclists kept in constant radio communication with their support vehicles. Huge cheering crowds lined the route. Motorbikes with television cameras broadcast live footage, as did television helicopters hovering overhead. Teams were also riding together.
The teams have come as part of the commercialisation and part of the tactics, and a lot to do with the safety of transporting a large number of riders, so allowing them to go in a peloton, groups them together, makes the management of the road much easier.
For viewers around the world, the race is a reason to rearrange sleep schedules to accommodate late-night viewing.
It brings people together. It's the ultimate cycling event, and so in that sense it's extremely important.
Located in the centre of Beijing, Tiananmen Square means Heavenly Peace Square, a name that belies the terrible events that took place there in 1989. Hu Yaobang, who, as chairman and general secretary, had led the Chinese Communist Party and the government of the People's Republic from 1982 to 87, died on April 15, 1989.
Thus, the funeral motorcade made its way to the cemetery for revolutionaries. An estimated 1 million people massed on the streets to honor the man who symbolized their hopes for political reform.
What happens very rapidly is that students begin not only to go into the Tiananmen Square and display their grief and frustration, but in that students begin to actually organize themselves. Tiananmen Square, of course, was built by the Chinese Communist Party as a means to engender a sense of strong mass mobilization. Now what we have, of course, is kind of inverted. The students very much taking over this political space and using it to lay out their claims.
What we want is only the democracy, only the freedom of the speech, not overthrow the government. We support our government to go on the reform.
By May 19th, crowds in Tiananmen Square had grown and included several thousands taking part in a hunger strike. In response, Premier Li Peng declared martial law, but the crowds did not disperse. The government's response was brutal. Around 1 a.m. on June the 4th, tanks broke through the protest barricades.
This is a big thing, right? Because historically speaking, the army under the Chinese Communist Party was an army that was seen as being always siding with the people, hence the name of the army, the People's Liberation Army.
Troops fired on civilians and students. Human rights groups estimating that up to 1,000 people were killed. The square was cleared, the demonstration ended, and in the days that followed, the government arrested thousands of people around the country on charges of counter-revolutionary activity. It is believed that about 1,000 people were executed. The Soviet Union condemned the attacks, while the United States and other nations imposed diplomatic and economic sanctions against China.
The procession continued as far as the eye could see. It took fully half an hour for them to file past the Chinese embassy, calling for the downfall of Deng Xiaoping.
The official Chinese response was, and remains, that the People's Liberation Army had defended the country against violent counter-revolutionary elements.
After 1989, China is still open. It's still open to foreign capital. It is open to a certain extent to ideas that might come in terms of how we reform on both the political and economic arena, but that becomes much more controlled, right? And any ideas that perhaps were seen as going too far, as it in 1989, very much disappear from the scene. And I think is perhaps the legacy of Tiananmen, laying the framework of how China was going to pursue its pathway of development from the 90s onwards.
The first crisis of the Cold War began in the divided city of Berlin, with a crippling Soviet blockade designed to bring the Allied-held sector to its knees. After the Second World War, Germany had been divided into 4 zones of occupation, shared by the members of the victorious alliance.
The chief business to be done was to agree the constitution of the Allied Control Commission with the fixing of zones to be occupied by Britain, America, France and Russia.
Berlin, which was in the Soviet-controlled part of the country, was, because of its status as the capital, divided in the same way as the entire country.
Nothing could be more farcical between allies, but the situation is also obviously inflammable.
The Western Allies had more or less given up on the collaborative government of Germany. The aim after World War II was not that Germany should be divided. The aim was that it should be governed collaboratively by the 4 allies and democratized and completely demilitarized and denazified.
But there was no common policy to achieve that aim. By June 1948, the British, American and French zones had combined into a single area.
But that collaborative government never worked. And by 1948, the Western Allies had given up. Above all, the United States had more or less given up. So within their own zone of occupation, and indeed in the British zone as well, they proposed to introduce a new currency, the Deutschmark, which Stalin saw as the foundation of a West German state and thus of the division of Germany, which he wanted to prevent.
Germany queued all day to get the issue of the new Allied money, which has caused so much trouble with the Russians.
To disrupt the consolidation of a West German state and to protest the exclusion of Soviet influence from the West, the Soviets began the Berlin blockade, hoping to drive Western forces from the city.
What was blocked was access to Berlin. So the Western Allies could not move anything into Berlin by land. And that meant above all food and energy. And Stalin's comment, of course, was, let us see what generals January and February can do. Let us see what a very bitter winter can do. So they needed to fly huge quantities of food and coal into Berlin, which is what they did.
2 days after the blockade started, British and American planes began landing at Berlin's Tempelhof Airport with the supplies. Within 2 months of the start of the blockade, the airlift was operating close to 1,500 flights a day and delivering a daily total of more than 4,500 tons of cargo.
And it's been estimated that 24 hours of the airlift is equivalent in organization and effort to launching a 1,000-bomber raid.
After 318 days, the Soviets ended the blockade.
It had failed. For as long as the air routes functioned, it was going to fail. So, frankly, the Soviet Union could have cut the air routes, but could only have cut them by declaring war. It would have had to send its aircraft in to engage American aircraft, British aircraft, French aircraft, shoot them down, and that would have led to general war.
Strength, resourcefulness and perseverance enabled the Western powers to beat the blackmail of the Russians and keep Berlin supplied until the blockade was called off.
Air travel as an industry also benefited, with the fast-paced air traffic control systems that were developed to cope with the number of movements later employed around the world. 1960s saw us achieve what had once seemed impossible when we went to the moon. But one of the greatest frontiers we crossed in that decade happened in South Africa, in the human body.
Remains a triumph of medical ingenuity.
Several doctors across the world were racing against time and against each other to be the first to perform a human heart transplant. The successful kidney transplant of 1954 spurred them to investigate the possibility in other parts of the body.
Norman Sumway, who was based at Stanford University, he had conducted a successful heart transplant on a dog in 1958. And it was actually his techniques of cooling down the heart and the management of the transplant that were used in South Africa by the first doctor to actually do a human-to-human transplant.
Dr. Christian Barnard of Cape Town, South Africa, was the first to complete the task. On the 3rd of December 1967, he transplanted the heart of Denise de Waal into the chest of Louis Washkansky. Denise had been in a car crash earlier that day, and after suffering severe brain damage, she had not been able to be revived.
And he said to me that Professor Barnard had offered him a new heart. Quite frankly, I thought he was delirious from all the drugs that he'd had. None of us realized that it would be true.
The operation lasted 9 hours. The new heart needed mechanical assistance to continue beating until Louis' body could take over.
It's difficult to make predictions and prognosis if you've not had previous experience. But I would say that I'm sure that he is going to live longer than he would have lived without the operation.
Louis survived after the operation, deeming it a success. Unfortunately, 18 days later, he died from a pneumonia infection contracted while in hospital. In the early days of successful transplants, patients did not live much longer than Louis.
The first heart transplant was an extraordinary achievement, but what had not been got right yet was how to stop the body rejecting the heart. And that was going to take to the 1980s for that to be achieved.
And his transplant operation was so successful that the only real setback he's had is a bout of pneumonia earlier this year.
Today, improvements in anti-rejection drugs has led to a yearly rate of 5,000 transplant operations, with close to 90% of patients surviving a year and 75% surviving 3 years after the operation.
The legacy is someone had to take that brave step. And once that was made, then that whole world of medical science asserting itself and saying we can repair and rebuild the human body. So I think in terms of just a vision for the future, it was extraordinarily significant.
For 100 days, a chaotic, brutal slaughter would convulse through the African nation of Rwanda. In its wake, close to 1 million people were dead, and the world was in shock at the brutality inflicted by one group of humans on another. In 1994, Rwanda comprised 3 main ethnic groups: the majority Hutu, the minority Tutsi, and an even smaller population of Twa. Despite sharing a language, religion, and cultural traditions, racial tensions had existed between the Hutu and Tutsi for decades. The catalyst that converted those tensions into awful violence occurred on the night of the 6th of April, 1994.
Well, that night, an airplane coming to land at Kigali Airport, the capital of Rwanda, was shot down by a missile. To this very day, we don't know who did it. Both sides have implicated one another. But the result was that within minutes or hours, a genocide campaign was started by the Rwandan military, assisted by the Rwandan militias, in rounding up and executing prominent Tutsis and moderate Hutus based on hit lists that were pre-prepared in advance.
On the 7th of April, the country's major media broadcaster called for the Tutsi cockroach to be eliminated.
But these are the real faces of fear in Rwanda, Tutsi civilians facing systematic massacre.
Neighbours killed neighbours, and some men killed their Tutsi wives. Bodies were hacked to pieces in a vicious frenzy, and many were dumped into the Kagera River, eventually floating into Uganda's Lake Victoria.
They're like animals. They killed each other worse than animals. I can't believe it. I cannot believe God created people like that.
The United Nations was strongly criticised for its stance during the 100 days of genocide, evacuating only Western citizens while close to 1 million people were being slaughtered.
Well, this was one of the darkest chapters in the UN's history. Both the professional UN, the official UN, and the political UN, which is the states that made up the UN, have effectively stood by as hundreds of thousands of men, women, children were massacred in the streets of Rwanda.
Coming after a failed military operation in Somalia, there was little political will to intervene.
And in the case of Rwanda, Rwanda was a small country without a strong economic imprint. Most of the countries were not at all interested in Rwanda, and the few who were had a stake in the existing government rather than in overthrowing of the government.
A French-led UN mission was eventually sent in on the 22nd of June in the southwest, but the killings continued until the 4th of July, when the Rwandan Defense Force took control of the country. 2 decades of unrest followed, costing the lives of perhaps a further 5 million more people. Genocide trials started at the end of 1996. Former Prime Minister Jean Kambada pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life in prison. His conviction was welcomed, but it could not erase the memory of what had happened. Nothing could. The scale of conflict and destruction on the Eastern Front in World War II was without equal. It began when Axis forces invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941. For 18 months, they pushed eastwards, and then the tide turned. When, after swift victory in Western Europe, Hitler turned his forces east, Joseph Stalin, the Soviet dictator, who had ignored intelligence reports of German troops building up at his borders, was briefly paralyzed with shock.
The Germans initially invaded Russia in the summer of 1941, and they had a lot of success. They got within about 50 miles of Moscow, and there was very much a feeling that next year's campaign would knock out the Soviet armies entirely.
The Soviet, the United States, and Britain are fighting on till Hitler is beaten into the ground.
Winter halted fighting, but with the spring of 1942, Hitler resumed what was intended as the final offensive in the east.
The Stalingrad operation was launched as a two-pronged operation. Half the army would head south to the Caucasus oil fields and would really take away Russia's ability to drive its industry and to fuel its vehicles. But they would also capture this very strategically and symbolically important city on an important bend in the River Volga, and that was Stalingrad. And there was a feeling from Hitler in particular that they had to capture it to tarnish Stalin's image.
More than last year, Hitler fears the mounting strength of the powers of freedom.
German forces assaulted and moved into the city. Stalin had a choice: resistance or surrender. As bombs were dropped on the city, he forbade any evacuation, even of children. He commanded the city to fight to the end. Vicious hand-to-hand combat from street to street characterized the savage battle. Behind the Red Army was the vastness of the Soviet Union. Behind the Axis troops was a long and uncertain supply line.
Hitler's Sixth Army was surrounded and is even now in process of liquidation.
They had a big problem, particularly after encirclement. Goering had convinced Hitler, as he often did during the Second World War, that actually the Air Force could solve the problem alone and that they would be able to deliver enough supplies to keep the army fighting for as long as they wanted to, at least until another German army could break through. But that simply wasn't the case. They couldn't get anything like the number of supplies through to the German army fighting at Stalingrad, and so slowly but surely that army was starved of both ammunition, vital war material, but also food, and it of course gradually lost the capacity to resist.
The carnage came to an end in February 1943, when the German Sixth Army commander, Friedrich Paulus, promoted to Field Marshal by Hitler because, the Führer reminded him, no German Field Marshal had ever surrendered his command. Surrendered the remaining 90,000 troops of his army to the Soviet forces.
The loss of Stalingrad and the loss of the Sixth Army at Stalingrad was the first major setback for German troops during the Second World War. It was very much the turning point of the war on the Eastern Front and arguably the turning point of the whole Second World War. From the point of Stalingrad, it was really heading backwards all the way, a slow, gradual retreat with the odd counterattack along the way until the Russian armies finally reached the gates of Berlin.